Hi, everybody, and welcome back. As we said, that was a short break.
Yep.
We're back. I'm still Brian.
I'm still Aaron.
And we're going to kick off Module 8 with archiving and monitoring. These two modules, not necessarily go together. Compliance is part of archiving and monitoring, sort of, kind of loosely coupled. They were shorter modules, so we wanted to tie them together. And then we're going to have a demo after this break, after the end of this module, that is persistent chat as well as a really quick monitor archiving demo. So with that, we're going to talk today about describing and what is the archiving service and the monitoring service, and then we're going to wrap it up with how do we configure archiving and monitoring. And this is not a new concept. This has been around for a very long time. Since 2010, we've always pushed the importance of the monitoring service whenever voice was part of your deployment, because otherwise you didn't know what was happening. And then archiving was always something that, from a compliance perspective, either was a good idea or wasn't a good idea, depending on if you wanted to keep the data around. As we mentioned shortly or partially or slightly earlier in session 1 of yesterday, the archiving options include Exchange 2013 now, but not required. We can still use a SQL backend if that's what we have. We don't have 2013 or don't want to tie it into 2013.
No, if your regulatory requirements don't let you put that data in Exchange, or your regulatory requirements don't let you move it out of region.
Very rare. Okay, so with that, let's look at this module. The archiving service. There's features and components. The IAM archiving itself. We have a compliance piece within the archiving component and module. And then we have configurations and policies. Like any other part or piece of the Lync infrastructure, everything is controlled by in-band policies, and archiving and monitoring are no different. So the biggest change that we have to report is a yay for a lot of people. Coming from 2010, the archiving and monitoring role is no longer a separate role. It's now part of every front-end pool, whether that's a standard edition pool or an enterprise edition pool. It's a checkbox. No, enable or not enable.
Agreed. Right? It's nice to not have to have a separate server to host that. It's one of the places where they gave us the ability to reduce server count.
Right. And if you're saying, well, great, I'm adding this new web application component, companion, WAC, WAS, whatever you want to call it, server, look at it as a net, not gain or loss. Instead of, if you had the archiving and monitoring role,
zero.
You roll it back and it becomes part, and that server now becomes your WAC server. So, you know, it's a win-win for everybody.
Zero-sum game.
Yeah. Well, Exchange integration is an option. So if you want to be able to leverage the Exchange store and tie the communication directly into Exchange, that is an option. And then it's all discoverable via Exchange, and you kind of removed the discovery options out of Lync and pushed it to the Exchange administrators. If you want to give the Exchange people want to add data to their store and you want them to be responsible, that's a great option. Push it on the Exchange team. That, again, becomes a very searchable, live stream of data that you can look at and access directly from within the known compliance role of Exchange.
Can a user access their compliance data in their Exchange mailbox?
They can't. They actually cannot. The Exchange data it's actually not even in a visible folder. The data's in a little hidden.
It's effectively in the deleted items folder of the user's mailbox that they can't access it.
It's not counted against your, I guess depending on how you configured Exchange, but it's not counted against your mailbox count. We're just storing it in this hidden folder that you could see through your
compliance tools.
But you're not going to see it through the user himself.
Outlook isn't going to download that and cache it on their machine.
That's right. Now, don't get confused with saving my conversations.
Right.
That's still going to be within Outlook if you have that option turned on.
That's still your conversation history.
And conversation history is conversation history. Users can delete it.
Modify it.
They cannot change compliance. So compliance is exactly that. It's going to be what was said, when it was said, and who it was said to. And then the SQL store, we have that option as well. All the databases that we select for archiving and monitoring have the option, if we're not going to store it in Exchange, to be part of a SQL mirroring, similar to the way that we do the front-end roles and the various user and security and CMS databases. So we do have an HA solution that is all managed through the Lync console if Exchange is not determined to be where we want things to go. It's also interesting to know that if you do configure Exchange, and after you've configured the integration, it's not set up correctly, not working, you'll be in this uninitialized, unworking state. At that point, stuff's still going to the SQL database because we haven't actually flipped it yet. So there's never a loss of data as things are happening until we can get it to Exchange. It's not in Exchange, it's going to the SQL backend. So
Do you have to deploy the SQL backend if you're deploying Exchange integration?
You do not, but if you don't and it's not working, you don't have anything. So, but it's also interesting if both are set up and configured. In theory, you could have a lot of data in a lot of places. So,
but any one user's data should only for their communication and their side of that communication in one of those places.
That's right. But if it's not working correctly for all users in Exchange, or they're not configured correctly in Exchange and SQL is configured, you could have some archiving in SQL, some archiving in Exchange, and it could get a little unruly. So you just want to know what you're doing and make sure you're deploying it like you want.
Yeah, no, this is definitely a case where you want to manage it and understand where the data is going and keep an eye on it.
Now, like previously, we have agents that are running and capturing the data. So as you're communicating and typing instant messages, and things are being run through the system, there are data collection agents that grab it and then kind of push it off in a lazy state per se. I mean, things are backed up and it's not high priority to get it to, but it is going to get there. And just like we had in 2010, if things don't get there, we can shut stuff down so that things aren't working. From a compliance perspective, we could say, oh, we're not capturing data to make sure we don't lose data because of regulatory requirements. We can just shut down instant messaging. Bad experience for the users, but if that's what's required, that's what's required.
Yeah. If your requirement is keep all the data, if you aren't keeping data, you can't let the users send anything because then you can't keep it.
Right. And if you don't have it, you don't have it. So okay. So what is archived? What's not archived is always the question that comes up. So obviously, instant messages, that whether they be peer-to-peer or they be multi-party, if there's a web conference of some sort that's going on, we're going to content that's uploaded, things that are transferred in those conferences, we keep and we maintain. Anything that's created from a whiteboard and a poll are created down into documents and pictures that we can then look at. What's not archived is anything that's a peer-to-peer file transfer. So if I'm just talking to Bob, or I guess I could use Aaron. If I'm talking to Aaron and I decide I want to transfer him a file and it's a Word doc and off it goes and the system permits it, that's transferred directly to Aaron. It doesn't ever hit a compliance or an archiving store database. If, however, I then bring it into a multi-party and have that conversation, then those documents are then archived because it's part of the communication that happens at the conferencing level. Audio and video are never saved anywhere automatically in an archiving solution. So if you're looking for it to be some sort of recording for an audio solution, that's not going to happen. You still have the desktop side recording options. Those exist, but you're not going to be able to do it from an automation compliance perspective. And then desktop and app sharing. We're not doing screen captures and any kind of movie files of what's happening from a application desktop sharing perspective, so that's not there. You do get the markers within the archive that say it was started and things happened, but you don't get the actual data itself. From a compliance perspective, which is separate from the normal archive, and if we turn compliance on, the question happens, what's being archived? And you'll notice basically the same thing. The big difference is, well, we have what we have. In fact, if you look at the previous slide, oh, look, they look identical. And that's because they are. Whether we're in compliance or whether we're in archiving, it's all the same thing. The difference being from compliance, it's a separate archiving solution that things are going to in addition to.
Sure. We got a quick question from the field. Do you know if it's going to be the case where you can, if you're running a split domain exchange model with an Exchange 2013 tenant, will a user's archiving or compliance data get pushed into their Exchange 2013 mailbox in their tenant?
In the cloud now. So we support archiving and monitoring for on-prem only within Exchange 2013. Now again, if that's the Exchange model you have, okay, but you still can get the exact same storage and compliance by going to the SQL backend. Unfortunately, that means you're going to be using either PowerShell to script that or custom SQL scripts to find data.
Sure, you've got, and in that case, in a Exchange split domain model, your on-prem users are going to get archived potentially into Exchange, and your cloud users are going to get archived into SQL. Honestly, in that environment, I'd probably just keep it all in SQL.
Yeah, trying to do a search from a compliance perspective or from a discovery perspective and going against two different environments, you're complicating the world. There could be business drivers of some sort that, for whatever reason that happens, maybe the people that are on-prem are the only ones you care about that are archived, and you want them in Exchange. I mean, there's all kinds of variations that could happen. Just keep in mind that people that are in the cloud, we don't have the same ability to get the Exchange archiving to happen like we do with on-premise. So, configuration of archiving is very much the same of any other configuration of a policy or how things roll down. So your scopes are identical. Your scopes can be global, site, or pool level. And it's important to note that even if you've enabled archiving, set up the servers, until you actually configure archiving for one of those three, whether it be a pool, site, or global, nothing's going to happen. You've got to turn it on. You also have the option to say, in this configuration, am I archiving only instant messages, or do I want conferencing as well? So you have one or both. And then you also have the option to say, am I going to purge data that's in the SQL database after X amount of days, or disable purging altogether, and you have to purge manually in some manner or function. One of the options is when I pull the data from PowerShell, go ahead and purge the data from the database once that's done. And that's used very often with third-party applications that are pulling the data out on a cycle. There's some sort of pull job that's happening. That data is moved over to where they then consume the data and put it into their repository. So at that point, once that's done, we can go ahead and purge it from the SQL database back in. You also notice that there's the flag to say, is Exchange integration enabled? And if so, then we're going to go ahead and flip that on. Of course, all this can be done from PowerShell, and it's also exposed directly within the GUI. From a policy perspective and a scoping option, again, when we're talking about Exchange, the archive parameter is either on or off in Exchange. We have to be able to have Exchange archiving on. And then the user will be listed in a various functions. So if you were to get the Exchange mailbox, you would see it's either uninitialized, it's using the Lync policy, it's not archiving, or it's archiving to Exchange. So the various ways and functions and is it working, is it not working, will be seen within the mailbox type of Exchange, because that's where we're telling archiving to happen. Okay, so that's archiving. Fairly straightforward. Again, not a lot has changed. The big changes is, to recap, is that it can go to Exchange 2013 only, on-prem only, and it also has the information given that it can all be installed on a single server, the front-end service. It's not a separate role feature anymore. In addition to archiving, or in addition to, in place of, in lieu of, we can also do the monitoring service, right? We can add the monitoring service only, or the archiving only, or both. It's really, it's your option. We give you feature.
Is the monitoring role important?
Monitoring role is overly umpteen times important, especially when enterprise voice is enabled. Otherwise, there's no way to tell what's going on in the environment.
Conferencing, I think. In your environment, you can maybe get away without the monitoring role if you're just doing IM and presence. But just as soon as you turn on conferencing, or any dial-in conferencing, any web conferencing, or any enterprise voice features, get the monitoring role up. Look at what's in there. Look at what's in the reports.
That's right, because the reports tell us not only from a troubleshooting perspective, it also gives us the trend analysis of what is going on in the environment. It also gives you, from a phone inventory perspective, what's being used in your world, what does work, what doesn't work, what has a high quality, high value of poor quality versus what works really well. And you'll see certain devices, typically built-in microphones and speakers, that have a high echo. Yet you'll look at other devices that may be from a device that's marked with the Lync certified, and their quality will be amazing. So you'll be able to see the differences in devices. You'll be able to see the differences in routes and physical servers that are having problems, physical servers that aren't having problems.
Network switches. I mean,
all of that. Subnets that they're coming from.
Yeah.
Wireless, are they not? When we're going outside to a point where we're going and how it's getting there, and our MOS scores that come from that. So all of that's in the monitoring service. And unlike 2010 and 2013, it's just a checkbox on a SQL backend. So if you're enterprise, potentially you could use the same SQL backend. Again, the recommendation is always to break that out, have at least its own instance so that we don't impact our front end. But it's much more lax than 2010, since the SQL backend isn't as heavy as it was in the 2010 world to 2013. Okay. So the features and components. Similar to when we're talking about archiving, there are components that exist to collect the data and then push the data over to the SQL database. From a features and new in 2013, the reporting is better. There's more reports, deeper reports. Dashboard views have always existed, and we have multiple views there. What we like to call the C reports, or when you're going to have this dashboard up for people to look at that are coming into the NOC and they want to just see what's the live world going on, kind of thing. We do have comprehensive data for tracking and analysis. That's really great for when somebody calls with a failed call and you need to go back and see why did it fail. We'll have error codes, and we'll have every call that's ever happened or tried to happen in the environment, and we'll be able to do some analysis directly on that call, even after the call's happened, and without us knowing the call was going to happen. And that's important, because we're tracking data. As long as we can get that endpoint to report it, we're going to have information. And then, of course, the infrastructure's changed, which we talked about. There are the data collection agents in the databases. SCOM can tie directly into the QoE to provide active and proactive information to give reports and
just
information.
like in 2010.
Yeah,
we've
no
got
difference
that,
there.
We've got those the test command lets the sorry, I'm
There's a
blanking on
term,
the name for it.
Yes.
I know. I just made you do the same thing.
Yes.
Moving on.
So yeah, they can tie in to do some automation and then report back to the database and make sure things are working up. So, and then of course we have the monitoring server
Synthetic
reports.
transactions.
Synthetic. Thank you. Which need to be configured correctly, or they don't work, by the way. But that's all documented.
With users and everything.
They have to have pseudo something happening.
Yeah, the TechNet write-up for that is quite
clear.
detailed and quite clear about what's required. One thing to think about, if you've got a large deployment of Lync 2013 and you're deploying the synthetic transactions, you're going to need 2 users on every front end or 2 users on every pool in your environment to be able to make these calls and make these tests
to make them valid.
correctly.
Yeah, because you can make the calls to everybody, but you'll never be testing their pools if they're not between pools, between distances. What's your latency? What's your call? I mean, when you think of synthetic transactions, it's user A calling user B. How good's the call?
Yep.
And if all of a sudden that call quality drops dramatically, there's where SCOM kicks in and says, whoa, something's bad happening on the
or
network.
doesn't complete.
Right. And then, of course, the monitoring reports exist. Those are SSRS, or SQL Server Reporting Service reports. They are completely customizable if you want to. It's the canned reports that are given out of the box from Microsoft to get you on your way with a lot of good data. And again, if they don't meet your needs, you can always pull whatever you want against the SQL backend. There's nothing that's keeping you from querying that database. Unlike the other SQL databases of Lync, this one we can talk to, because we don't impact the Lync production environment by impacting that particular database, assuming you've architected it correctly.
Right, so that's the other piece of this. The data that goes into the monitoring database is pushed in there by SQL. It is no longer, or pushed in there by Lync. It is no longer accessed except to run reports.
That's right. It's static data.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah, and it's so again, the data is there. It's up to you to either access it with the built-in reports or build your own SQL queries to do so. So it's nice data. It's historical data. You're never going to get data in the QoE that is live. It won't show calls that are currently on. What it's going to show is how that call performed or how that conference performed at the conclusion of the conference. All the reporting data is pushed up. So if we look at the configuration of how this works, we have a caller and a Lync person, and they're talking to one another. They're running through the front-end server. At the conclusion of that call, their endpoints report up their experience of the call. The server, based depending on where it is in the leg, it may be the mediation server and its experience outbound on whatever trunk that's going to happen. And together, all that data is then pushed up to the remote SQL database, where we get to view it from an SSRS perspective. SSRS is nothing new. It's gotten better and better from the SQL team as things have moved along. We do allow you to share a single SSRS environment with Lync. Keep in mind, in this example, we have Forefront, we have DPM reports, we have SCCM up here, and then we have Lync all running on this SSRS. Just keep in mind, again, it doesn't have to be living on your SQL server. It can be a shared instance that you're using somewhere else, but the rights cannot be changed or variated from the SSRS environment in totality. Otherwise, you could potentially break your Lync server reports. The monitoring policy, when we look at that, again, we spoke shortly of the archive, and when we look at the monitoring, it's very similar in concept, where we have the option of, do we enable it, do we not enable it? What scope and what level are we going to put this at? Is it going to be at a global scope or a site scope? And then when we look at, are we purging the information? Because if we have unlimited data, great. You're going to get a lot better trending if you can keep it for years and years and years. But if that's data is of some concern, we can go ahead and keep the data for an X amount of days. In this example, it's 365 or a year, which is a decent trending analysis. Things probably will change in a year that the old data won't be as relevant anyway. So if you can keep a year's worth, good for you.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of organizations in their monitoring data really only keep about 90 days of data.
Right.
It's one of those where if after 3 months you haven't been able to notice that there was a problem,
There probably isn't a problem
anymore.
It's gone. I also want to point out from a policy perspective, it is only global and site level that exist for the monitoring. You can't set this down to a user level, which is interesting. But we're saying we're not dissecting this into a per user we want to watch from a monitoring. It's either the site's being monitored or globally the environment's being monitored. All right, so now configuring. We've gone over this a little bit, but implementing, configuring the two options, archiving and monitoring, and we'll look at it real quick. And in the demo, we'll quickly show how this happens. It's not hard to do, and similar to PChat, very easy to implement. So we'll actually join those demos into a single demo. So from an archiving perspective, we need to figure out what our scope is. So do we want it at the global level or the site level? From a criticality perspective, this is where, similar to everything that since archiving has been enabled, is if archiving can't happen in a predetermined amount of time, or it's down, or we're not getting those messages delivered to the back end, whether it be Exchange or to SQL, do we shut down the instant messaging store? And the idea there is we don't want to lose any archiving information. So if conversations have happened and we haven't been able to deliver them to a store, at some point we shut it down, all of instant messaging, shut down the front-end service. At that point, we know that we've got all the IAMs queued up. When the backend's repaired, we'll deliver those IAMs, and then instant messaging will continue. But if we can't deliver them, we're down until we can figure out how to get those messages delivered. And again, that's a compliance thing.
Sure.
The critical mode.
Related to that, and actually tying into back to persistent chat, somebody in the chat window asked, "Is persistent chat room data archived in the same way?"
Is persistent meaning are we?
Right, persistent chat data, when somebody sends an IM to a persistent chat, is that managed through the archive role?
Oh no, it's managed through the persistent chat compliance role.
Right,
it's a whole different
this is a
role.
little different thing because that communication is happening through a different protocol and not really transiting the front end in a lot of ways. It isn't captured by the archiving role of the Lync server. If you need persistent chat compliance, you have to implement the persistent chat compliance service and the backend persistent chat compliance backend.
That's right. Even though the persistent chat, like we said, it's running over SIP and it's all within the same client, it is completely a different service and different servers and roles and things that are happening. So that communication is archived separately and independent of the archiving of instant messaging and conferencing. The good news there is if you only need persistent chat to be archived, you can. If you only need instant messaging and or conferencing to be archived, you can. If you need both roles and both configured from a compliance perspective. How archived data is managed, how it moves forward, that's part of our implementing and solution. A lot of this is back to the business drivers. If you're going to be archiving, there probably is a business reason you're archiving, and there'll be specific rules of how, the length of time they need to be archived, what needs to be archived. Is it internal communications? Is it internal and external communications? That kind of thing.
So there was a question. Somebody noted that files, when they're transferred person to person, we don't capture the file.
That's correct.
In the archive. Do we capture any data about that? Do we know what file name was transferred or anything?
When something's transferred, there's a flag that happens in the archive when you pull it back that says a file was transferred in the name of the file. Same happens when desktop sharing is brought up. While we don't capture the desktop sharing, we showed desktop sharing was enabled by participant X, and the time it starts and the time it stops. So we keep a timeline of things that happen. We just don't keep the data. Okay? Configuring the archiving service. Again, we have to decide, is this going to be a SQL stored to archiving? Are we doing the SQL backend, or are we going to do Exchange? If we're doing Exchange, we have OAuth we have to configure and work with, the server-to-server authentication. We have to figure out, is it a global site or user level? And then we have to decide, are we doing internal, external, or both? What kind of communications are we interested in? And all of this should be driven, again, from the business requirement of archiving. It shouldn't really be something that we have to kind of guess at when we go to implement this. It should be very clear and straightforward. These are my requirements. This is how I implement it. All right. So more for you to know is what can be done, because the question may come up. We want this and this and this. Can it be done? And it's got to be a yes or no. So, from the monitoring service, again, you have to have a SQL server that you're going to be storing this data on. The deploy SQL Server reporting services is highly recommended, so you can use the built-in reports. Technically not required. You can actually in fact, be turning this on and not deploy SSRS at all forever. But the data's still being stored. You're not have an easy way to access it.
Right, but consuming the data is probably pretty important, not just keeping it there.
But there are times when there are clients that have customized front ends and they're not technically using SSRS, or they may be using the back end, but their own custom stuff. Sure, I mean, up to you. However you want to get to the data. Microsoft has simply made some nice reports, and if you don't want to use them, that's up to you, but you should.
Yeah, so if by chance you don't turn on monitoring, is that data still captured anywhere? Is it still sent from the client?
We just aren't storing the data anywhere, right?
Yeah, it's this little sort of a chicken and an egg thing. In a monitoring environment, if you haven't turned on monitoring, and I place a call to Brian, at the end of that call, I will actually still send a blob of data up to my front end containing the data about the quality of that call, but the front end just discards it.
Right. Yeah. And it's also interesting to note that the servers themselves, that's from a client perspective, those servers, from a servers, they don't gather the data if they're not told to gather the data. And they definitely don't store the data unless they're told to store the data, client or server. So, yeah, the information's there. As soon as you enable it, all the information will be gathered. Obviously, anything previous to being enabled is lost. You don't have any information. This is something that should be planned and designed from the get-go. Again, probably 95% of implementations are going to want to have the monitoring service enabled. Archiving, again, is a business driver requirement, if it is at all. But you are going to want to go ahead and get monitoring enabled. And they've made it simpler to do so because we can simply enable a checkbox without having to deploy another server for this. When we define the SQL store in the topology, it does have to be a separate store if we want it to be its own instance and its own SQL server. We don't have to. We can, in fact, use if we have an enterprise pool, the enterprise's SQL's backend, it will allow us to do that in the topology. Again, depending on what your backend is, this may or may not be recommended. But it can be done. We then associate the Lync stores to the pools so that we know that we can access it, and then we deploy reports if and so we want to use the built-in reports. To configure it, it becomes just as simple, and we saw the little screenshot previously. It can be done through the management shell or control panel like everything else. If it can be done through the control panel, it can be done through management shell. 60 days and CDR and QoE all for the same number of things. You can save call detail records for longer than your QoE data if that is what you want. There may be reasons to do so. Maybe a billing perspective if you're pulling that data for some sort of internal usage. But CDR is your call detail records. Did the calls happen? The QoE is how well did the call perform.
And one thing to remember when you're viewing this in your monitoring server reports is, in fact, if you pull up a report that you think is just QoE data, it probably pulled something from the CDR database to display you some piece of data about that call, even though the quality data is coming from this QoE database.
Yeah, and then there's the multiple databases that get deployed when we do this. The CDR data is almost always accessed because that is when point A talks to point B, and when you're looking for quality, that's 90% of the time is figuring out for this call what happened. There are generalization information that's in QoE only, such as the overall, how did what's a good example? How did this server perform from a mediation perspective overall? What's the best server versus the worst server? Which pool's doing the best? That's not necessarily user-based, but as soon as we get into any real information you're looking for, which is typically what happened during this call, that's using CDR data. And that's it. That's all we have for this particular module. So that wraps up persistent chat, archiving, and monitoring. Like we said, we're going to take a normal break, and as we come back from this break, we're going to go ahead and do a demo of those three environments, assuming everything's happened. Now, we did pray to who we needed to pray to.
And sacrifice to check into the...
I don't know. I didn't do the sacrifice. Guys. Just throwing that out there. But if there was a sacrifice, that's good to go.
I just had chicken for dinner last night.
Okay, so we're all good. So with that, we will be back, and we will see you in a few. Thanks so much.
Thanks.